Hello, and welcome to this mini lecture on the English-speaking world based on Chapter 1 of Aspects of the English-speaking world. We're going to start this mini lecture by taking a quiz. So you're going to need paper or a pen and pencil, or of course, you can do it using Microsoft Word. We're going to go through a few questions. Afterwards, answer them, pause the video if you'd like, and then you'll get the answers. This is based on basic information about English. Now, the first question is, how many people speak English? Question 2 is, what language is English most related to? Question 3 is, name a country other than the UK that has Queen Elizabeth as their head of state. Question 4 is, what is the language of Shakespeare called? And you can choose here between A, Old English, B, Middle English, C, Modern English. I'll pause the video and answer the questions on this quiz. Now, English is spoken by 1.3 billion people. The language that English is most related to is Frisian, a language spoken in the northern part of the Netherlands. The country that has other than the UK, that has Queen Elizabeth as their head of state, there are several of them. A few of them that we'll talk about in this course are, for instance, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Jamaica. So Queen Elizabeth is also in Canada known as the Queen of Canada, the same in Jamaica. She is the Queen of Jamaica. The language of Shakespeare is not Old English or Middle English, but it's actually Modern English, a form of Modern English that we call Early Modern English. Now, we're going to continue with a brief history of the English language. Now, English is spoken by 1.39 billion first language and second language speakers. Now, the term first language we will refer to in this course and in most linguistic courses as L1. And second language speakers, which a majority of the people in the Netherlands are L2. So an L2 language is any language that you've learned that wasn't spoken at home or that you didn't speak from a very young age. L1 speakers, there are only 480 million of them. Now, English is a West Germanic language, so it falls first under the very large umbrella of Indo-European languages. Then you have Germanic languages, and in the Germanic languages, we have two branches. One of them is the Northern Germanic languages. Those are the languages that are spoken in Scandinavia and also, for instance, in the Faroe Islands and Iceland, also partially in Greenland. So languages like Danish, Icelandic, Norwegian, Swedish, etc. We then have the Anglo-Frisian language group, which is a branch of the Western Germanic languages. Now, Anglo-Frisian only has two languages in it, and that's English and Frisian. And the reason why these two languages are, for instance, different from Dutch, because a lot of people will say, well, if I listen to Frisian as a Dutch speaker, I can understand it way more easier than, for instance, if I'm a Dutch person listening to English with no knowledge of English. That is true. However, there are some basic differences that we see only in English and that we also see in Frisian. So for instance, if we look at something called palatalization, the K noise and the G or G noise in Dutch and German, for instance, changes to a ch or a y noise in English and Frisian. So a good word is the word cheese. So in English, it begins with a ch. In Frisian, they also say cheese. But then, for instance, in Dutch, it has a k. So the different part of the palate is used. They say kaas, or in German, of course, Käse. We can also see this with words like church, for instance. Kerk has two Ks, and then in English, it becomes church. This is a way that linguists has grouped these two together. Now, English has been known to have three major shifts. And this is when we refer to the language broadly, we'll think of it as three different versions of English. The first one is, of course, Old English. And for the purpose of this, we're going to look at the same text and we're going to look at it 3 times. And an easy way to do that is to look at prayers because we have evidence of the way that prayers were written. And this, of course, is the Lord's Prayer, the most common prayer in Christianity. Now, there are a few things when we look at this Old Anglo-Saxon or Old English prayer that can show us that it's a lot different. First off, when we look at it, we can see a few major differences between modern English. The first one is we can't understand almost anything. We can see certain words like the first word, father, and we can also see other words like become, etc., that make us think, well, yeah, we can see a few English words in there. If you also know that the G isn't going to be pronounced as a G, but more like a Y, then we can see words like today. But a few things that we have to look at is that there are different letters. So the first one is that we have the combination of the A and the E, and then we also have what looks like a D with a line and the P, and this is, of course, the thorn, and these are going to be pronounced as a TH would in normal English, either as a lenis, where we say the, or a fortis, where we say the. And we can also see that the Y in a lot of cases is going to be pronounced as an U noise. So we have, for instance, vader, ure. And when we look at this, we can see in Old English that this is very different from the language that we currently speak. And that has to deal with the fact that there were two invasions that happened. Now, the first invasion didn't really change Anglo-Saxon. That was the Vikings. The second invasion in 1066 was when the Norman French under William the Conqueror came. And after this, English changed significantly due to a French influence. Now, this led to what is known as Middle English. Now, in Middle English, we can actually start to see that the language is recognizable. Here we see that the change has also happened. So the first one is fada ura. We said father or, and now there's even grammatical changes. We can now see that it's ura fadir, that artin heofnis. We can see here that a few changes still haven't occurred. So the letter V is quite new in English. We can see here that in the first word heaven, that is written with a U, but it would be pronounced with a V. We can see that the G and the Y are still problematic letters, and they can be, the pronunciation is based on the word itself. And we also see the big difference between Old Anglo-Saxon or Old English and Middle English is that we have French words that have been added. If we look, we now have words like temptation and deliver, and these are all words that have come directly from the French influence. Now, the next shift that we have happens a few hundred years later, and this is then when we get into early modern English. Now, early modern English is the current prayer that a lot of people, this is, for instance, the prayer that Catholics would use, that still has some different and archaic language, but in modern English speaker, a contemporary English speaker can totally understand it. So here we have our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy. So we have here words like art, so we can see here that the third person is still going to take a different inflection. It'll have a T inflection, which is also common in a lot of other Germanic languages like Dutch, where we also have T inflection when we have the third person. And we have words like thy. Now, thy, bizarrely enough, a lot of people would think, as in a lot of other languages, that when you pray that you would then use the formal version. For instance, in Dutch, u instead of jij. But in this case, it is not the formal, it is rather the informal. And actually, the word thy and you are slightly different. It wasn't that one was necessarily more polite or more impolite. It was more, one was personal. You knew the person. You would then say, for instance, thy or thou, and one was less informal. So you knew the person a lot less, and that would make it then, we would today consider to be formal, but it's actually slightly less impersonal, and that was you. English stopped using this in present day English, but it was still common in the 15th, 16th, 17th century. So thou is the same as the nominative, or in Dutch it would be jij. Thy or thine is then going to be jou, and this of course is based upon whether the next word begins with a vowel noise or doesn't. And die is then jou, for instance, without the W in Dutch. We also have, when we look at this, we can see that it's very similar to the Dutch gij, which is also used a lot of cases in prayer. But this early modern English, so for instance, the language that Shakespeare also spoke, this is still something that uses almost the same words, even if the grammar or even if some of the words seem archaic or a little different. Now, if we look at these three invasions, the first one was the invasion of the Anglo-Saxons. And we can see here the Anglo-Saxons, it's referring to two groups of people. Now, these two groups of people came in at the end of the height of the British Empire. The Brits, the Romans, sorry, left the UK. And when they did, the Angles and the Saxons came from what is today Germany and Denmark, and then they went to the UK, primarily to look for new farmland. With them, they brought their Germanic language. The language before then that was spoken in the UK was then mainly a Celtic language. There were other groups that came along with them. It was actually the three major groups were the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes or the Utes, and these are then in Germany and Denmark, and then also a significant number of Frisians came from what is today the Netherlands. The term then stuck Anglo-Saxon, which then is the current word that we also use to refer to things that are typically British or that typically have to deal with the language. So when these people came, they brought with them their Germanic language, and we can see that they dominated the culture in the area. How can we see that? Because we see very few words from the Old Celtic that have made their way into the new language. A few of them that we do have are words like bog and also even, for instance, words like London. But for the rest, we don't see a lot of these types of words. Now, the second came a few hundred years later, and that was the invasion of the Vikings. Now, when the Vikings came, you would say, well, they must have spoken almost the same language. That wasn't quite the case because the people in Jutland or the peninsula that's part of Denmark were generally still West Germanic. But when the Vikings came, they did speak a similar language. It was a Germanic language, and at the time, people were more nomadic, so you didn't have a lot of variation. A lot of times, people could understand each other. But northern Scandinavian languages like Old Norse were significantly different. So we can see here by the new words that we get in the English language that Old Norse had a major impact and that there was a lot of mixing between the peoples. We have a lot of words that came from Old Norse, and you can see some of them just based on some characteristics. Now, the big one is if you see SK words like sky, skill, or ski. These words almost always come from Old Norse. We also have some basic words like law. For instance, in a popular term in Scandinavia that's often, for instance, written on court buildings, especially if you go to Copenhagen, you can see that med lov skal man landsbygge. And that is then, of course, with law, man can build countries. And we have words like law that come into English. Also words like sail, egg, dirt, call, and take. Call and take are two big words that, for instance, in languages like Dutch and German, other West Germanic languages, they use a completely different word. So in Dutch, for instance, you say give. That's the same as in English, geven, geef. But then when you say take, you say nemen. Well, in Scandinavian, for instance, they still use words like ta, take. We also got some interesting grammar. That is, for instance, the word they. So in Scandinavian, there is a difference between he, she, and it, and they. And in Dutch and German, there isn't. So in Dutch and German, you use for the third person plural, you generally use the same pronoun as you would for the first person female. And in Scandinavian languages, they use die, for instance, for they, deas for their, and dem for them. So these are some important grammatical changes that also came when these two groups of people mixed. Now, the third invasion that was really important was the Norman French. And as I said earlier, this happened in the 11th century. More specifically with the Battle of Hastings in 1066. A French king, Norman French king, William the Conqueror, came, and with him he changed British social fabric. He brought a certain form of feudalism, and he also started doing impressive things like giving us a census. We knew how many sheep there were when he invaded. Now, Norman French drastically changed English. What happened was that we got several new words, and a few examples of these can be, for instance, the difference between an animal versus its meat. Now, just like with the invasion of the Vikings, it doesn't mean that these new words took place of old words. The old words were always kept in English. So when we look at animals, for instance, we can see that the word cow, which is an Anglo-Saxon word, is the word that we use for the living animal, the animal itself. The meat, for instance, though, we took the Norman French word. So we have cow, and then we started using the term beef. Chicken, we started using the term poultry. Pig, we started using the word pork. We also have words like deer. We started using the word venison. We also had a large and expansive new vocabulary, words like regal and royal, but then we still kept the Anglo-Saxon words like king. Now, it's very important to understand that one of the reasons why this happened was that when the Norman French entered, the kings of England still considered themselves to be kings of France. And actually, from 1066 until around 1413, we can say around sometime in the 15th century, people in the UK, in the upper classes, so the lords, but also the king, were not English speakers. So when we're looking at Henry III, Henry IV, even to a certain extent Henry V, they did not speak any English in the court. It was around 1413 that English started becoming the official language of the kings. And that meant that you had two groups of people, the peasants speaking a form of Anglo-Saxon that was slowly changing, and the king speaking Norman French. Now, what we're going to look at now is a difference, a change from looking at the history of English, but more what English actually is and how we can classify English and English speakers. Now, the way that we're going to look at this is based on KACHRU'S circles, which he came up with in the 1980s. Now, if we look at this diagram here, he has three circles that he used. Now, he has the inner circle, which has countries like the US and UK, the outer circle, which consists of countries like India, Nigeria, and the expanding circle, which is essentially all the other countries. Now, KACHRU'S circles have an inner circle, which are the native speakers. And these people are important because they all speak the English. It's their sole language or their only language. And they live in countries where English is the majority language. And he calls these people norm setting. So they decide what is normal and what is correct or what is standard English. Countries like this, the largest, of course, is the USA, followed by the UK, Canada, Australia. And each of these countries has a standard form of English, and this is what we essentially consider to be standard or correct English. Followed by this, you have the outer circle, and these countries are ones that are administrative countries and use English as a form of a lingua franca. So countries like India, the largest, definitely followed by Nigeria, Pakistan, even to a certain extent the Philippines. These are countries that promote the use of English often as a way to ease ethnic tensions or linguistic tensions between different groups of people. So if we look at the complicated role of English in India, we can see that it was the language of the colonizers, but it allows people from different ethnic groups to speak to each other if they don't necessarily understand each other. India has hundreds of official languages. Now, their sheer numbers are norm promoting. Norm promoting means one of the reasons why English stays important and relevant is that countries like India, Nigeria, etc. still use it. And finally, we have the expanding circle. And these are countries that have what we call EFL, or English as a foreign language. And these countries are norm dependent. So they're learning English as a foreign language. This is different from English as a second language. ESL is only taught in countries where English is an official or is the L1 language. Like if you're learning English in the UK or the USA, that's called ESL. If you're learning English in Holland, that's called EFL. And these countries need the countries in the inner circle to decide what the rules are, what correct grammar is, etc. Countries like this, of course, are the Netherlands, Russia, Brazil, China, to name a few. Now, we also have to think in this first chapter about why English is such an important language. So, it's good to take a moment for yourself and think, why did you study English? Was it maybe the culture? Was it for work? Was it easy? Was it television? So take a moment and think of a few reasons why you think English is an important language. Now, Jeffrey Harmer, who's an important linguist, said that there were 5 reasons why English is an important language. The first one is British colonialism. The Brits throughout, starting in the, let's say, 1500s, started colonizing North America, and afterwards, until the height of the British Empire under Queen Victoria, we then have English being spoken by nearly 1/4 to 1/3 of the world's population, or them living under English colonialism. Second off, we have American economic dominance. So after the fall of the British Empire, we then have the next large empire, if you will, our next large world dominance is also by an English-speaking country. So when we look at the 20th century, we can really call it the American century. After the Second World War, especially, America became the world's largest power, but also economics-wise, the United States is still to this day the world's largest economy. It'll be interesting to see in the future if English still stays relevant with countries in the East becoming much more powerful and also much more wealthy. Now, the third reason we can actually say is the internet. With the dominance of the United States, and in many ways the head of technology being in Silicon Valley in California, the internet has taken on a definite English quality. A lot of content is offered in English. This makes it important for people who are gaming or people that are using the internet, that are looking for information, that they have to use it in English. It's also the case with academic journals, often written in English. The next one is tourism. English in the 20th century became the language of tourism, and through tourism and mass tourism, it's become more important that if you're going to travel abroad, say that you're Dutch and you're going on vacation to Greece, most likely you're going to ask the waiter for a menu in English and not in French or not in German, even though both languages have a larger population of speakers in the European Union. And finally, we have pop culture, or the media. In the West, in the 20th, and still to this case in the 21st century, English has been the language of pop culture and of the media. We can also see this, for instance, in a lot of European contests like Eurovision. A lot of the songs will be sung by people who don't speak English, but they will sing in English because it is the current language of culture and media. Now, there are a few things that you can have a discussion with your classmates about. One of them is which form of English is most correct. The British English, American English, etc. Who should decide what form of English is correct? This is something that KACHRU talked about when he was making his circles. He actually said English has several different forms of English. So there's an Indian English, and it is as correct as British English. And this led a lot of people to disagree with him. Also, when we think about English, what about minority Englishes? For instance, Black English, Kiwi English, Jamaican English. Does their difference make them less valuable than the more commonly used forms of English like RP or General American? These are definite things we have to think about when we look at language, because language is often a way for us to discriminate against other people. People who speak different, use different words, have certain accents. Does that make them less? Does that make their version of English or the culture that it represents any less? So that is the end of this mini lecture. However, there are a few terms in the book that haven't been covered on this mini lecture. For instance, Globish, KACHRU'S Revised Circles, the first dispersal of English, the second dispersal of English, present day English, EFL and ESL, and ESP and EOP. So I recommend that you look at these terms and you consider them because they could possibly be on the exam. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a good day.